Welcome to Ep.4 of the Recap Podcast. I'm Brandon Roth. The guest today is Robbins with GreenRock Capital. He's a provider of PACE financing, somebody that's been in the industry for a very long time. I started talking to him about PACE back in 2017, and the conversation you're about to hear covers interest rates, loan sizing, eligible expenses, case studies, everything you're going to need to know about the PACE world. If you have any questions, please send me an email at brandon@lakebrookcapital.com.
This is the Recap Podcast.
So for those unfamiliar, can you share a quick overview on GreenRock?
Yes, GreenRock, we founded GreenRock 3 years ago. We actually launched it in my garage during COVID. So it's a true garage startup. And we launched GreenRock for two things. One, to really continue to innovate and around how PACE is deployed to the marketplace. We're headquartered here in Northern California, and there are about half a dozen of us on our team.
And what is CPACE?
CPACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, and is based on traditional assessment financing, which has been around for well over 100 years in many states. And really what CPACE allows for market participants to do is to access private capital for the development of projects that benefit the public good, repaid via an assessment on the property tax bill. And we can go into what that really means here during this talk.
And so what are the primary benefits of PACE as it relates to real estate investors?
Yeah, so there are a number of benefits, and depending upon how PACE is being utilized at the asset level, there are benefits from a structuring standpoint in terms of how the capital is structured. It's not a traditional debt. It's structured as an assessment. Because it's an assessment and runs with the property, literally shows up as a line item on your property tax bill. There are no covenants, financial, operational, or otherwise, non-recourse, typically 20 to 30 year fixed rate financing, and it's prepayable. And that prepayment schedule is typically negotiated based upon the needs of the property. And in terms of how it's repaid, literally you'll get your property tax bill, let's say for here in California, you have your ad valorem tax, and then you have all of these line item assessments. This is now a new line item assessment for repayment of the PACE principal and interest. In the event that the property owner does not pay their property tax bill and associated assessments, since in most jurisdictions you can't partially pay a property tax bill, all that would be due and payable is that outstanding assessment. So PACE can never accelerate, nor can it ever be called in the event of non-payment of a property tax bill. And that's a big thing for senior lenders who typically look at, oh, wow, I might be getting primed here. I'm getting primed. Well, in the event of that non-payment, they still have all of their rights and remedies under their loan documents. And all that is due and payable at any given time ahead of the senior lender is the current tax bill and any default payments. The important thing to note is that the credit department of a lender, when they're looking to consent or being asked to consent to a PACE assessment on a property where they're either the first or the second secured lien, what they're looking at is, all right, in the event of non-payment, that's typically going to trigger default under my loan documents as a senior lender. And so I will most probably, step in and bring current that delinquent tax payment and associated assessments. And so just need to make kind of accommodations that in the event, if that ever happened, I would need to now cover off that PACE assessment.
Right. Got it. And can you explain what happens to PACE upon the sale of a property?
Yeah, what happens to PACE on a sale of property is just like any other taxes, any other assessments, it transfers to that new owner. So it's very ubiquitous. It's just kind of passes on to the next owner. There's no documentation that needs to be signed, or it can be prepaid or paid off.
Right. And that's something I find interesting, because a common objection you hear from senior lenders with PACE is that it's senior to the senior mortgage. And I don't feel like that's necessarily accurate, because in the event of a sale, the proceeds are not paying off the PACE. The proceeds are paying off the senior lender. And then on top of that, it never accelerates if there's a default. And so I don't think calling it senior to senior lender is, correct portrayal.
This has been, you can imagine 12 years ago when we first started having these conversations with these senior lenders, and kind of that knee jerk, oh, we're being primed, to fast forward, and $6 billion, plus or minus of commercial PACE has been transacted, almost all with senior lender consent. In terms of that comment, it really depends on how the credit department of XYZ senior lender looks at PACE. And even those that understand it's non-accelerating, non-callable, prepayable, are still looking at, okay, what's my detachment point for my loan? And that's where we have a lot of those conversations. So if the detachment point for a senior lender is 65% LTC or 70% LTC, then we kind of work backwards and say, okay, well, what if you, senior lender, have a first lien, and outside of PACE, your first lien is at 40% LTC. Now you have PACE, non-accelerating, non-callable, prepayable, bringing that 40 to 65, maybe high 60s. Then the way that we look at it is, while we're sitting on the tax roll, so we are ahead. That payment, if in the event of a default non-payment of the property taxes, and then a subsequent foreclosure where the senior lender did not keep current those taxes, we would be paid our delinquent or payments before anybody else. Now, the other thing that comes in to your question too is coverage ratios. So the question in the conversations that we typically, and our peers typically are having in the market, comes down to, let's look at PACE in totality. Let's look at the structure. Let's look at the rate. Let's look at PACE in addition to your senior, and then let's look at a takeout, 3, 4, 5 years from now. Our coverage ratios, can you check the box on coverage ratios, which is kind of a huge focus at any time, but especially in today's world. And to kind of walk through and bring up those issues that senior lenders at least are thinking about, if not, coming out and asking about when consent is being asked for. And we find that having those conversations instead of, hi, Mr. or Mrs. Senior Lender, are you okay with PACE? And leave it at that. That's going to be a very different conversation than going in, determining how much PACE is eligible at an asset or a project level, structuring that, and then, sitting down and having conversation more holistically with the senior lender.
No, I think that makes sense. And I think about it and compare it to ground lease financing, meaning when a property has a ground lease, in my mind, there's more risk there than there is with PACE, because the ground lease payment is going to increase over time, right? Whereas your payment is fixed for 30 years. But most of the market is comfortable with ground leases, whereas with PACE, it feels like it's earlier in its adoption rate, and people just really need to understand how it works, because I don't see PACE as a riskier proposition than a property that has a ground lease on it.
I would concur. And that kind of the step ups on an annual basis is huge, and that could be 2%, 3% a year, and can definitely add up from a ground lease perspective. And we also find that with PACE, there's no intercreditor agreement. I mean, it's really flexible, quiet capital. We unlike Mezz or Bridge or some other options in the market, in the event of covenants being tripped or whatnot, we can never step into a project. And we're finding that especially in today's environment, when other participants, be it lenders or otherwise, understand that fact alone is pretty huge.
No, it's massive. If you don't pay the ground lessor, that could be a huge issue with the ground lease entirely being accelerated. Or if you don't pay your PACE payment, you have, one tax payment due to bring it current. So I think that it's a massive difference. And so what are the common scenarios where real estate investors or developers are using PACE?
Great question. So today, what we're seeing is PACE being used in three different ways. First, where there is new construction taking place, PACE and construction debt coming in for 65, 70% LTC of the capital stack. And for one of my comments earlier, that senior kind of construction debt attaching at 40 to 45% from a first lien perspective. The second, we're seeing this reimbursement really kind of take off. And what this structure looks like is in California and a number of other states, a developer or owner can look back 2-3 years and reimburse themselves for capital spent on these PACE eligible measures and use those proceeds for anything. But in today's environment, what those proceeds are generally being utilized for is to, one, pay down a senior construction lender. And if that lender would like to stay in the deal for relationship, they like the transaction, but they need a significant pay down and kind of rehydrating debt service or operating reserves, then that's a great use. We're also seeing construction debt that has come due or is coming due, and there's going to be a requirement by the lender to kind of put in, for the sponsor to put in additional capital to pay off the construction debt. So we can come in with PACE and new financing, new debt, to retire the construction debt. And again, typically sizing up the PACE to maximize the amount of PACE so that the new debt coming in is maybe 35 to 40% LTV, with the PACE making up the rest. And the third way is this, what we call hybrid financing. And that is coming in kind of late stage construction where budgets have been kind of blown up and timelines have extended, where we come in and we do kind of a look back reimbursement on the one hand for those eligible measures that have been completed. And then we fund future PACE eligible measures in the construction budget that will be built. And so, where there's some of these kind of maybe almost a TCO, but needs another 8 million, 10 million, needs some more liquidity. This is a great option to take a look at. One of the things that we didn't talk about, and I've mentioned a number of times, these PACE eligible measures. People might be thinking, well, what's a PACE eligible measure? And the PACE eligible measures typically fall into 4 buckets. The first is energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is very wide ranging. It's everything from the envelope of a building to all the systems and so forth. The second, water conservation measures, low flow fixtures, irrigation controls, gray water systems, if jurisdictions allow. The third, renewable energy and renewable energy plus, so predominantly solar And then the plus is EV charging stations, battery backup storage, and the like. And the fourth, and this is a kind of a trend that is accelerating in the overall PACE market, is resiliency measures. So here in California, resiliency would include seismic strengthening or seismic work, wildfire mitigation. In other states, might be hurricane or tornado proofing. And so when you look at those four kind of buckets of measures against, let's say, a construction budget in California today, typically 45 to 55% of all hard and soft costs are PACE eligible, which is quite a bit.
Right. And when you're looking at how much PACE you'll provide to a developer, you can look through the budget and see 45 to 50% of costs are eligible. But what other sizing constraints exist when you're calculating your total PACE amount?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so from a sizing perspective, we always start out and do that PACE schedule analysis, look through the hard and soft cost budget. That will tell us how much PACE eligibility there is at the project level in the budget. The second is what PACE program is the asset reside in. And each PACE program, slightly different one to the next in terms of how much PACE can be utilized at a project level. So here in California, 25-30% of the as appraised stabilized value. That's true in other states. In some states, there's a cap at 20%. And so that's the one of the many things that we do and our peers do as well in the market. We'll do kind of that initial sizing exercise and then determine, within that PACE program and market, how much PACE can be accessed by the developer borrower, and then put together directional terms to start the conversation.
And are there minimum and maximum amounts that are a fit for these programs?
Yeah, some programs, might have a minimum of $2 million. Others might have a minimum much lower. For instance, here at GreenRock, $4 to $5 million would be our minimum, and really no maximum. But that's, generally that kind of $2 million on the minimum side. But we do know of some of our peers in the market that are focused on providing financing, down to maybe $500,000. But again, that's also going to be determined by the program as well.
And can you touch on pricing and how is PACE priced based on the various programs?
Yep. So generally speaking, in the market today, PACE pricing will typically, the benchmark would be the 10-year treasury. And for new construction, 360 to 400 over. Reimbursement, and depends on, again, what asset sponsor, how far along is the asset, to stabilization and so forth. But that could be anywhere from the 10-year, 325, 330 to 360.
And when you think about the all-in rate there, because you're pricing over the 10-year treasury versus bridge lenders pricing over SOFR, and right now the 10-year treasury is approximately 100 basis points cheaper than SOFR. The all-in pricing is significantly cheaper than where senior loans are right now. And I think that's a big change in the market, because when you and I first started talking about this a number of years ago, senior debt was much cheaper than PACE, which made it challenging from an NOI perspective and a DSCR perspective. But now the world has changed a bit, where senior loans are now more expensive than PACE. So it's accretive to bring PACE into your capital stack.
No, absolutely. And that was a challenge for a number of years, because PACE was priced higher, and where it attaches, should price, on par or through senior debt in any given market. And kind of that's the goal down the road. So if you look at those numbers that I just, those rates that I just, discussed, yeah, SOFR 260 to, 300, for reimbursement to new construction, which is significantly lower as I'm sure you see on a daily basis with in the market and with your clients, and especially construction debt today. And one of the big things too is kind of going back to how PACE is structured, not as traditional debt, and not having any covenants and no recourse. So that's huge from a sponsor perspective, but also if I'm the senior lender and I know that, that tranche of capital in the capital stack is not tying back to, from a recourse or a covenant perspective, my borrower, that's another positive.
And when we bring you a deal and you receive the underwriting materials, what does the process and timing look like from the moment you receive those materials to when you're providing a term sheet, and then how long does it take to close typically?
Yeah, so let's take California just for by example. Once we get the detailed budgets, once we have determined that the parcel is located in a PACE live market, and understand what the goal of utilizing the PACE at the project level is this new construction, reimbursement, paid out of construction debt, or so forth. It takes us, we'll create that PACE schedule of values as I talked about, and provide directional terms and structure. That takes anywhere from, around a week, maybe. So that takes a week. And then in terms of upon a signed term sheet, and if there is a lender in place, understanding that they will provide their consent to close, anywhere from 45 to 60 days. So it's pretty quick. And if it's new construction and a construction lender is underwriting concurrently with us to a close, a concurrent close, then most of the time we're kind of following the timeline of the construction lender or the senior lender in their process. That brings up a really good point too, that for construction, PACE for construction or for value add projects, we definitely like to be talking to the senior lender or the proposed senior lender early on to put together an integrated drawn disbursement schedule so that everybody understands how funds flow post-close into the construction project.
And you mentioned that PACE requires lender consent. Can you talk about what senior lenders you've seen that are already open to PACE, or maybe what lender types are most open to PACE?
Good question. From a lender type perspective, we've seen more regional or kind of the super regionals consent. We have seen some of the money center banks consent as well. It's really been, up to this point, a project by project basis. And I know that there are various lists of, 300 lenders or whatnot floating around in the marketplace. I personally discount those lists. I think they potentially cause more problems than they provide answers to, because it's really important to, if you've got a big lender and you call your relationship manager over there, who knows if they were involved in that one PACE deal that was consented to somewhere in their organization. And if they weren't, they're going to say, I don't know what you're talking about, potentially. But from a trend perspective, the senior lender, the lender community is definitely paying a lot more attention to not only what is PACE, because we're being asked about providing consent to PACE in transactions where we have a really long-term client that is asking. And we're finding that many lenders are spending the time to understand how to consent instead of saying no. And we see that trend is probably going to be accelerating here over the next 12 to 18 months.
And I think what might be helpful for people is to hear a couple case studies. And you closed one recently that was in the news and was high profile, called Lakeside Center. Would you be able to walk through that?
Yeah, so Lakeside Center, TMG ownership, and PG&E headquarters, new headquarters in Oakland, California. Very interesting project, and this was a reimbursement. the owner had purchased the building and done $300 million of improvements. And those improvements were pretty wide ranging in terms of seismic, HVAC, MEP, and so forth. And we worked with them to access $172 million PACE financing, and we actually did that through the muni markets, which was pretty interesting. And all that being said, is we packaged up the PACE assessment, we got it rated, and we worked with KeyBank Capital Markets and their muni desk to sell it into the market. So the use of the proceeds was to pay down the lender consortium and for kind of replenishing some debt service reserves. And that was very beneficial to all stakeholders in the deal. And I think is a really good example of how PACE for reimbursement can help, especially some of these larger projects that are really good projects, great sponsors, and just from a timing perspective, can utilize some liquidity to right-size loans. And again, the debt service, or these proceeds can be used for anything. So it could be debt service, it could be operating reserves, it could be TIs and commissions, which could fall into operating reserves. We're seeing more and more interest in potentially purchasing in the money caps with proceeds as well.
I think that's a good segue into a deal that you and I worked on recently in Seattle, and I'll just share it with people in a quick breakdown. And it's a common situation that a lot of lenders have right now, where they have multifamily properties across the country that are over levered, 90 to 100% plus LTV, and they're trying to figure out how do they get a loan extension, what are their options here? And especially when banks have a loan that is below a 1.0 debt service coverage ratio, it causes problems for them internally, as they have to change the risk rating on the loan to what they would call criticized and reserve a higher amount of capital to protect against any potential loss on that loan. So on the deal that you and I were working on, it was for a developer that had a loan that was going to be maturing shortly. The property was 90% plus LTV, and the debt service coverage was around 0.9. And so the benefit of bringing in PACE into that transaction is they, first of all, qualified for roughly $10 million in PACE proceeds. And the uses of those proceeds were going to be to pay down the senior lender, buy a 3-year interest rate cap that was in the money, and would bring the debt service coverage ratio from 0.9 to 1.25. And that rate would be synthetically fixed for 3 years. If I'm a bank and the option is to bring in capital to reduce my loan exposure on this deal and to increase my debt service from 0.9 to 1.25 for 3 years so you can buy some runway to a better time, I think that's a great option for somebody, as opposed to forcing a sale or potentially putting a property in default. It's an option that I think all banks should be considering right now.
I would agree, and I think that's a great use case, and I think there are a lot of those out there in the market today.
And you and I started talking about PACE back in 2017. Can you touch on how the market has evolved since then for PACE and where you see it going?
Yeah. 2017 to today has been a huge kind of maturing marketplace from a PACE perspective. And this really kind of kicked off, 18 to 24 months ago when the credit market started, moving. Back in 2017, many fewer states had actually passed legislation. So you didn't have this coverage where kind of a larger institutional player that was looking at utilizing PACE and then looking at their portfolio were saying, well, only 10% is covered by PACE jurisdictions. That is significantly different today. The cost of PACE today compared to other options in the debt markets, we're kind of on par with or pricing below senior debt. And so that's another kind of big check mark. And because of kind of the confluence of events over the last 18 months, you have institutional players who prior didn't have any need to even understand what PACE was because it was priced too high. They had access to a tremendous amount of very inexpensive debt and equity. But now everybody's looking for kind of creative ways to solution, a new construction project or a refi or whatnot. And PACE is a great option to at least consider in the market today. And it works across all, kind of not only asset classes, but from an institutional player down to a merchant builder. The other thing that we're seeing is these deals are getting much larger. We mentioned the 172 million last year. We are working on, and I know that our peers in the market have similar size deals, a number of which are over 200 million of just PACE. And so it's in the kind of more and more institutional players are learning about it, understanding where it can add benefit to their portfolios and to their capital strategy. And I think that, I know that as more and more of these deals get completed and announced, that's only going to continue to kind of increase the interest around what this asset class is.
And when it comes to investment banks packaging PACE bonds and going to the market, how are rating agencies currently treating PACE, and where do you see that going?
So rating agencies, DBRS traditionally has been the primary rating agency for pools of PACE assets or single asset PACE. We are hearing that there are, the big three are coming out with their rating methodology from a PACE perspective here in the coming months. And that's going to, at least we think, significantly change how investors kind of in that market who really rely on ratings and secondary markets for these assessments and bonds will look at kind of pricing and structuring. So we think and feel that as more rating agencies come into the marketplace, that should help increase the pool of investors and buyers of these assets. What we'll probably see from there is, tightening of spreads.
And I think that makes sense when you think about the risk of a PACE investment. It's hard to come up with a scenario where a PACE investor is going to lose any capital. And so you would think that would result in lower pricing over time.
That would be a really good assumption.
And so if there's real estate developers listening to this that want to reach out to you to either learn more about PACE, or maybe they're trying to figure out, what their property would size for, or what potential an LOI would look like, what's the best way for them to reach you?
CRobbins at GreenRockHC.com. Send me an email and we'll get in touch with you and start working through the process.
Great. Really appreciate it, Chris. Thank you for going through all this. I know PACE there's a lot of questions around PACE, and I think it'll be helpful for people to have a resource where they can refer back to understand how it works.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon.
This is the